Hi, I'm Mark Rossano, founder and CEO of C6 Capital Holdings, coming to you from Prime Revision Network. So before we get into our normal EIA show, we wanted to talk about, what is obviously happening in Russia and Ukraine. As we talked about yesterday on the Econ show, we broke out some of the potential that could happen. What are some of the things that were coming through? And as you remember, going back to our conversation about this in early December, we laid out two paths. We laid out one for maintaining force and using espionage and subterfuge and how that would work, which we thought was going to be the more or the way that Russia was going to go. And then we laid out what it would look like if there was a full-on invasion and why Putin would want to go that route. So we laid out the two. Obviously, we know which one Putin chose. And, this was the one that we thought was the least likely to take place, just given what the ramifications and knock-on effects would become. So we've been covering this in terms of what could happen. We're going to cover a bit more about the Black Sea, the Sea of Azov, and why that matters so much in terms of where this could go going forward. But there's obviously going to be knock-on impacts. We so far have the Urals that have gone no bid. You can't get a line of credit for them, so there's no buying, and especially as we start to see your sanctions. We know that Putin fully factored in sanctions. He didn't think this was going to happen without severe sanctions, and he doesn't care. And that's the biggest problem when you look at addressing the current situation, as we're going to go through some of the economic impacts, because this was all in his models. Like, he just assumed this was going to happen, and it just was of no interest, because as we've seen time and time again, bullies typically react to force, which is unfortunate given the fact that they have a large amount of a nuclear arsenal. So when you look at what the sanctions have been, sanctions continue to come out. There's talk now of the U.S. carrying out a broad cyber attack to disrupt their operations, which, when you think about what that would mean, at this point, it would actually be something meaningful, only because we're coming into nighttime. Russia has been able to move in assets and helicopters that have night vision capacity. So by being able to disrupt that would hopefully stave off some additional capacity. We've moved assets closer to the border. When you look at the F-35s and you look at military capacity, and then we've had some emergencies declared in several of the Baltic states. The question will be, what does the U.S. do next? And we're going to go through, and I should say NATO in general, we're going to go through some of the different pieces right now. So when we look at just what Russia's putting on the water, again, they produce over 10 million barrels a day. This is just looking at what goes on the water. So you can see here that they're gonna expected to export about 4.2 million barrels a day. And just to be clear, this is a day. And when you look at where a lot of this is flowing, specifically on the Ural side, you can see that this is where we're seeing them go no bid. So the offers have been as low as $12 below dated Brent. It's just, it can't be purchased, and it won't be purchased given the uncertainty of obviously where sanctions will be and when will these refiners be stuck with this capacity. So when you look at real shortfalls, this is what a real shortfall looks like, when you have about 4 million barrels in total based on what's going on pipe, what's going on water, that will not find a home and that will not be consumed at this point in time. And then we'll go through natural gas and grains in a moment. But this gives you an idea of some of the real impacts that are going to happen, because a lot of these Urals do end up in the European market. And then they also typically end up in Asia if they don't go into Europe. So then the question will be, what does China do? What does India do? And, we know that Modi and Putin were supposed to speak. They, as we said in yesterday's show, so far, China and India have not said anything on condemning what they've done. And this was before the initial assault, when we were talking more about the LNR and the DNR. And this is what is shifting at this point. So will they sanction them? Will they come out and say that what happened was wrong? Is going to be an unknown. China, we don't think says anything, but India is kind of the coin toss because they do need both the U.S. and Russia, and the question will be on what side do they end up falling on. So then when we look at how is this going to be enacted overall, you can see that there's different shifts. So the Russia was supposed to increase its exports in March. It doesn't matter at this point because it's not going to go into Europe or the US. But then when you can see some of these other pieces, so Nigeria will likely increase some of its throughput. Angola's obviously selling much faster than what was initial. Nigeria will be the same because now you're going to have a situation where you're going to get this pivot in terms of what, making sure you can get out of Russia and start buying other barrels. So that's going to do well for the West African side. And you're going to continue to see, obviously, Brent is over $103. And that's going to be just a matter of the consumption and the demand for the local crudes, as well as West African, Libyan, and then U.S. will also see some benefits. So that's where we're going to see some of these shifts. Now, the big question, which isn't shown on this chart, is what does the Middle East do? What does OPEC do? Do we see them increasing throughput to meet some of the shortfalls? I'm not saying they're going to meet all of them, but will they meet some of those shortfalls, specifically going into the Mediterranean, into Northwest Europe, and into the U.S., given the loss of Euro barrels? And obviously, we have sanctions still on Venezuela. We have them in Iran, and then we have them, we'll likely have them in Russia as well. So then when you factor that in and look at Libya is in the middle of its own unknown in terms of the new prime minister being elected. Will that be accepted? Will there be some pushback? So even Libya is coming up to a potential questioning point at this juncture in terms of will there be a normal or safe transition of power from one to the other. Now, when we start looking at some of the other impacts, because obviously crude is a big one, but we also have natural gas. And this just looks at what runs through the Ukraine, and all of this, obviously, most of it originating from Russia. So when you look at what has happened so far, you can see that there's still normal, relatively speaking, flows. We don't, and we've said this before, and I've had multiple people asking me this, so I just want to reiterate, we don't believe that they blow up a pipeline. We do think that if things become a bit more extreme, we could likely see them hitting the power supply and or pump stations that are supporting these pipelines, because you would still render them useless, but you would also not risk any kind of environmental impact. You would be able to fix that faster than if you were to blow up a pipeline outright. So again, these are some things to look at. When we went through yesterday in fairly sizable detail on what the bottom of or the southern attack would look like, we were fairly on point. We didn't think that there was going to be as a big of a push down coming from Belarus and across from Russia, but obviously we were wrong on that, and they've come down very quickly. But here, when you look at Poland, when you look at Romania, a lot of these regions are now on high alert. Lithuania has gone into a emergency. Obviously we've had multiple claims of what is being moved. We'll talk about that in a minute. But this is one of the big pieces because there was a multi-pronged attack on Odessa. And Odessa is very important when you're looking at some of these different shifts, especially when we're discussing not only just energy, but also grains and fertilizers. So one of the other pieces, and this is something that was being used as a means of going in, the Russian defense minister says that the northern Crimea canal has been unblocked and water supply restored to the peninsula because Ukraine cut off the waterway off after Russia annexed Crimea in 2014, causing water shortages, which was well known. But again, this was something that was given as a reason to go in and to free up Crimea in terms of creating some of this connection. We were assuming that there was always going to be a land bridge that was built. Clearly, they went all the way across, and they've now denied access and taken the access of all waterways away from Ukraine and now continue to push north. But there is a significant amount of resistance that they're facing as they push north because a large part of the Ukrainian army was already positioned in this area. And as the night progressed yesterday, they were giving up distance to buy time and try to organize themselves, which they have continued to try to do to create some sort of counterattack. Now, when you look at a potential gas supply shock and what some of the potential hits, you get an idea of what this could look like. And this is just looking at from a 10% cut in the gas supply. We've shown multiple times the LNG component and how there really isn't enough to replace it completely. It could brunt some of the blow, but again, you're still going to get a sizable problem, especially when you look at price, in order to incentivize additional capacity to move over into this region. LNG is going to continue to feed through. It's going to be the market. Obviously U.S. gas prices are at $4.71. It's still going to make sense to go from the U.S. into Europe, but this is going to be a continuous issue that they're going to face. It will be slightly alleviated as we go into shoulder season, but slightly is the key, because as we had some charts on this over the last few weeks, there's Russia's base load. So you're going to take away base load through some of these sanctions, which will make things a bit more aggressive. Now, in terms of what is in the region, so F-35 fighter airplanes have been moved to Estonia and Lithuania additionally on Thursday. So again, this is something that is being moved forward. And this is just looking at some of the carrier strike groups that are in the region. So you can see that the USS Harry S. Truman remains underway in the Mediterranean Sea. They're active. We do have the personnel to counter some of this. The question will be, what do we do to try to tip the scales in the way of the Ukrainian military and allow them to buy time? We're trying to provide, based on what the airflow has been over Poland. We've been running different reconnaissance missions to try to feed reconnaissance down to the Ukrainian government, but so far we have not taken any action on a military side, whether that be on the ground or in the air. Chechens are now, there are several battalions that have linked up with the Ukrainian military. There were rumors that this was happening beforehand. It is now official that these individuals are now in support of the Ukrainian military and have linked up right around the Crimea region to try to stem some of that movement north. Now to look at some of the movements just in terms of what we've seen so far. This is just tracking the blitzkrieg across. The initial multi-axis strikes aim to disrupt Ukraine's efforts to respond to ground invasions, further securing Russia's dominance in the air over the country. Now, when you look at tank columns, tanks in general typically don't do well on surface to air. So they typically have anti-aircraft equipment with them. But when you look at these tank columns, you can see that they're light on that, because Russia has been assuming that they were going to maintain air dominance, which again is just showing that they didn't expect anything to really come from the U.S. or NATO in terms of a response. So you can see where some of the landings were. So far the Odessa's continued to push up. You can see that there was an attack there, and they continued to meet up and push north as they joined up. This doesn't show the topography that well. The next chart does, and will show you where so far there's been a slight pause, and rivers are obviously providing some of that cover. When you look at some of the different movements, you can see that they've come down from Belarus. Belarus has also linked up with the Russian military to move south, which is why some of these sanctions are also going to include the Belarus, not just the Russia. You can see that the inroads that have been confirmed and territory that has been ceded to the essentially the entities in general, the Russians in general, they've been able to take some of the airports through the use of paratroopers, which would be a concern, obviously, because now they can land additional military assets deep within the country and not have to worry about trekking across that land and stretching some of their supply lines. That's another key piece when you look at tank formations. If you have air support, they become easier to protect, but if you lose that, they become sitting ducks. So those are things that could be done, could be discussed as ways to counter some of this, as well as, and to marry that with some additional cyber attacks. So now when you look at Russian advancements in Ukraine, you can see where some of those advancements are. You can see the blue lines on the side. There's been advancements there as well. This is just what's been confirmed. Some of the other pieces that haven't been confirmed are obviously going through Odessa, but we know that there has been movement north and there has been a link up, but you can see that they've paused for the most part in the south. at the river. They've started to cross it in some locations, but so far that has been a point of contention when you look at where some of these movements have been. One of the other key pieces is the Kerk Strait. You can see that there has been a blockade in terms of what is being able to move through the Kerk Strait, and that's just moving from the Sea of Azov into the Black Sea. 12%, Ukraine supplies 12% of the world's wheat and 13% of the world's corn. So just to give you an idea of some of the concerns that are going to remain on the food side, Russia is now selling wheat to China. Before, China was not buying wheat from Russia. So we are seeing some of those shifts in general. Again, there are a lot of things happening right now. We're going to continue to follow this to look at what are some of the impacts from the energy perspective, from the economic perspective. But again, these are things that I think was very well situated, that there was a lot of expectations that this was going to happen on the sanctions front. So again, without some sort of more aggressive force, it is unlikely that any of these sanctions will deter further activity. We're starting to get some protests in Russia, and there's a clear no protest policy. So again, it's meaningful in the sense where it's showing that there are people still willing to stand up, but it's too little, too late, or pretty much no real impact. But it's just showing that there is some resolve that remains in Russia as things continue to shift. We'll continue to follow it on Twitter as well. You can follow me there. I try to use updates, post threads, trying to give what I can confirm, and then then some of them I also provide some of the other accounts that I follow who are very good at this. So I'm gonna in the next we're gonna talk about the EIA in a minute, but I just wanted to give this kind of update and separate it out from the rest of the show just to make it easier for everyone. So again, thanks again for watching. I'm Mark Rossano, founder and CEO of C6 Capital Holdings, coming to you from Primary Vision Network.